Hi friends, I'm Father Kerry Walters, pastor of Holy Spirit American National Catholic Church, and this is the fifth and concluding session of a special Holy Spirit Moments series on the documents and legacy of Vatican II, the great ecumenical council called by Pope John XXIII in the 1960s, a council that was designed to throw open the doors of Catholicism, to let the fresh air blow through the church and revitalize it. Now, in the first four sessions of this series, we examined the four fundamental documents that came out of Vatican II. They were called constitutions, you recall, the suggestion being that they were constitutive of the faith. But in addition to the four constitutions, 12 other documents were produced by the Vatican II fathers. Some of them were called decrees, some of them were called declarations, and they range over a variety of subjects, including ecumenism and missionary work, religious education, the duties and roles of bishops, the duties and roles of priests, and so on. Two of the declarations, I think, are of special importance for us today as we appreciate the message and legacy of Vatican II. One of them is on religious liberty, and the other is on the proper relationship of Christians to non-Christian persons of faith. The first of the document is called Dignitatis Humanae, and it was promulgated at the end of Vatican II in 1965. And the other declaration is called Nostra Aetate, and it too was promulgated at the end of Vatican II in 1965. So today I'd like to speak briefly about what these two declarations entail, and then to conclude the entire series with just a few words about the legacy of Vatican II and future directions that that legacy might move into. So first, Dignitatis Humanae. You and I as Americans are so imbued with the value of religious liberty and freedom of conscience that reading Dignitatis Humanae might not seem great shakes to us today. But I promise you that in 1965, in the Roman Catholic Church, it was as if a bomb had gone off in promulgating this particular document. Because you have to appreciate that for 2,000 years, Roman Catholicism had assumed that it was the only legitimate expression of the Christian faith, and had felt no compunction whatsoever, or at least very little compunction, about condemning and even persecuting persons who didn't follow exactly what the Roman Catholic Church thought had to be followed in order to be a good Christian. Liberty of conscience, religious freedom, they simply weren't on the radar. They were seen as dangerous and subversive. They were seen as rationalizations for rebellion against the church and consequently rebellion against God. So you may well imagine that when this declaration first came up for debate, even though there were many bishops who applauded it, there were also many bishops who were horrified by it and who fought it fiercely. Bishops, especially from Spain and Italy, were in the forefront of opposing Dignitatis Humanae. Cardinal Ottaviani from Italy, who we have already seen was a stalwart opponent of the Vatican II reform, came out strongly against it. And a French Archbishop, Lefebvre, came out so strongly against it that when it was promulgated in 1965 by the Vatican II fathers, he left the Roman Communion and created a schismatic, alternative, and very right-wing, very conservative communion. However, there were American bishops in attendance at Vatican II, and even though they had tended to hang back for most of the council sessions, perhaps because they were a bit intimidated by their more urbane and cosmopolitan European confreres, they came out strongly in favor of this particular document. And they were largely indebted to the thought and the teaching of an American Jesuit who spent his career at Boston College named John Courtney Murray. Murray was a political scientist who had been interested for a long time in the relationship between secular society on the one hand and Roman Catholic teachings on the other. And in the 1950s, he had actually written a few articles in which he insisted that what Rome needed to do was to begin to embrace the American ideal of religious liberty. He was silenced for those essays, and it wasn't until Vatican II that he was able to reassert what he had been earlier condemned for writing and saying. So his influence is manifest in almost every line of Dignitatis Humanae, and we should be very grateful for it, as a matter of fact. So what's the point of Dignitatis Humanae? Well, the title of it says everything. It's wrapped around, the notion of religious liberty is wrapped around the assumption that human beings possess an inherent dignity. We know this both from reason and revelation. We know it from revelation because we're told at the very beginning of Holy Writ that we're made in the likeness of God. And so we possess godlike qualities if we only use them, if we only nurture them. But we also know that we possess an inherent kind of dignity through examining ourselves and others rationally. We recognize that we have within us a faculty which we call conscience, which serves as our moral and spiritual barometer. If conscience is used correctly, and make no mistake about it, we can misuse conscience, we can twist it and turn it in order to justify what we want to do. But if we use conscience correctly, it will serve as a lodestone for tying us into the natural moral law, for telling us something about God. But the only way in which our dignity can be upheld, the only way in which our conscience can be honored, is if we are allowed freedom of conscience, is if we are allowed the freedom to follow the dictates of our conscience wherever it takes us. We can't be coerced into following a particular kind of behavior or embracing a particular line of thought if either of them go against our conscience. That would be to violate the dignity of human beings. And it would also be rather pointless because it would be trying to split us away from that moral compass that we all possess. Dignitatis Humanae then says that conscience should always be honored. And this is actually part and parcel of long, long Catholic tradition, even though it sometimes was ignored in the Catholic tradition, that the dictates of conscience should always be honored, and that neither state nor church has the right or the authority to try and either coerce or to inhibit religious freedom and liberty of conscience. We all, says Dignitatis Humanae, have a hunger for the truth, and particularly for religious truth. And it is wrong to in any way try to stifle that hunger through secular dictates or through ecclesial dictates. What we need to be allowed to do is to follow where that hunger takes us, even if it takes us in directions that the church may find bizarre or awkward or uncomfortable. So what we have in Dignitatis Humanae, then, is a wonderful harmony. It says that human beings should be coerced neither by secular authorities nor by religious authorities when it comes to matters of conscience, and that this freedom applies not merely to individuals, but to groups of individuals as well, to family units, for example, or to entire churches. However, it does leave open, and I think intentionally rather than inadvertently, the possibility that what individuals or groups of individuals might insist is a protected religious right may not be. Not everything, not every belief, not every action that persons of religion and religious groups insist upon are actually vital to their religious convictions and their religious persuasions. And if they are not vital, and especially if they seem to cause some sort of harm to society at large, it might be the case that the state, in fact, does have a right to step in and to curtail them. This is a topic that has become particularly pressing on the American scene in the last 15 years because we see many religious individuals and groups insisting that the government is interfering in freedom of conscience and religious liberty in any number of ways. So, for example, with the famous case of the Little Sisters of the Poor, nuns who take care of dying folks. We see that the Obama administration insisted that they buy insurance for their employees, which will also provide for birth control or contraception. And this goes against the conscience, not only of conventional Roman Catholics, but certainly of the nuns who feel as if their religious liberty rights are being impinged upon. We have also the suggestion in contemporary American culture today that the legalization of same-sex unions, of same-sex marriages, somehow is a violation of religious liberty rights. It's not clear exactly how either of these two particular debates will end, but it is the case that the Vatican II document Dignitatis Humanae seemed toward the end of the document itself to appreciate that these kinds of conflicts will arise and that there may not be an easy solution to them, but that what is valuable is having parties willing to discuss the different sides with one another, to hash it out in civil conversation until some sort of reconciliation is effected. The second declaration, Nostra Aetate, our times, in our day and age, is a short declaration, consists of only 5 paragraphs, that treats Christian proper relationships with people who are not Christian, but who are people of faith. And it is especially focused upon the Christian relationship with our Jewish sisters and brothers. It comes as no surprise that for centuries, Jews were blamed by Roman Catholics for the death of the Lord and were persecuted, sometimes viciously. Their property was stolen, they were forced into ghettos, they were murdered at times in horrible religiously inspired pogroms. And so what the Fathers of Vatican II wanted to do was not only to atone for that kind of horrible mistreatment, but also to suggest that in point of fact, all of us who come from different religious traditions profit when we learn to listen to one another instead of to immediately condemn and persecute one another. In our day and age, hence the title of the declaration, the world has grown smaller, say the Fathers of Vatican II. We've all become much closer to one another, and as a consequence, we can learn more about one another than we might have been able to in centuries past. And this is even more true today than it was during Vatican II days, right? Because we have the internet, which brings us even closer to one another. The world is even smaller than it was in 1965. In a way that the Church Fathers then could not have even imagined. Who could have imagined the way in which the internet has brought the world cheek to jowl, communities one with another? And so in this particular document, Nostra Aetate, what the Church Fathers do is to discuss the Christian relationship, the proper Christian relationship with Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and Judaism. And the bulk is given over to Judaism. The Fathers insist that truth subsists in the Catholic tradition. We saw that same claim, didn't we, in Lumen Gentium. Subsists in, is in a substantial, significant way. But that falls short of insisting that only the truth is found only in Roman Catholicism. The document goes on to say that all of us, every human on the face of the planet, has an invested interest in trying to crack the riddles of existence, and that many of us turn to religion as a way to do precisely that. And as a consequence, we're all in this together. We all share the same hunger. We all share the the same goal. We all engage in the same kind of enterprise. And so we do have something to say to one another. We have more in common, perhaps, than we have in disagreement one with the other. And we ought especially to feel close to our Jewish brothers and sisters because, after all, we come from their stock. There was some worry that this particular declaration would be buried in another longer declaration, the Declaration on Ecumenism, that what we now have as Nostra Aetate would simply be a kind of buried chapter in the Declaration on Ecumenism. And the reason for that is that some of the bishops worried that the Arab states would take offense at a declaration coming out of Vatican that prized Jewish culture and Jewish religion and Jewish tradition. But eventually, to their credit, the bishops in Vatican II decided that this statement was too important to bury inside of another declaration. And so they voted to make it its own declaration. And I'm certainly glad that they did. These two declarations, as well as the four constitutions that we've looked at over the course of this series, really did revolutionize Catholicism throughout the world. And I'm not just talking about Roman Catholicism, but the many independent Catholic jurisdictions, such as the one to which I belong, were revitalized as well and inspired. What did Vatican II do? What's its legacy? Well, what it did was to bring Catholicism into the 20th and 21st century by coming to the conclusion that even though the core of the faith remains eternal, remains stable, it is the duty of each successive generation of people in the Catholic tradition to find ways to express that core faith in ways that speak to the generation to which they belong. Some things change, but their expression can change in order to get the point across in more understandable and relevant ways to the present generation. Vatican II reconciled Catholicism, if you will, to the modern world without accommodating to the modern world, without insisting that it had to change everything in order to live up to the secular world's expectations. So, for example, Vatican II made it okay for the Church to reach out to the scientific community and to delve into scientific explanations of reality, into biology and evolution and astronomy. Vatican II made it okay to appreciate secular art forms and secular forms of knowledge, made it okay to go to university and college and to immerse oneself in learning that doesn't fall within the purview of the Church, but which is all to the greater glory of God. Vatican II chipped away at the rigidly hierarchical and triumphalist polity of the Roman Catholic Church. It did its best to try and show that all people, lay and ordained, are included in the body of Christ, and each and every person has a specific chrism given to him or her by God, and each of those chrisms are valuable and ought to be appreciated. The Pope, the bishops, the priests, the laypersons, that was the traditional triangle, yes, that defined the people of God. But what Vatican II tried to do was to argue that even though there's some virtue and some authority in that pyramid-like structure, that one has to keep in mind that the by far largest part of the pyramid is the base, and the base are the lay people who need to be incorporated more and more into the liturgy, incorporated more and more into decision-making within the Church, and incorporated more and more as evangelizers of the Word, because it's they who live more than the ordained clergy do in the everyday world. And so it's they who are better able to speak to like-minded people who live in the everyday world with them. Vatican II convinced the Church that what it really runs on is not power, but love and compassion. And that what the church ought always to do is to strive to remember that it is a pilgrim church. It is always on the way. It is always progressing toward the divine, and that it ought never to stop and rest upon any laurel that it thinks it might have earned. That revelation, in other words, is continuous. That tradition isn't something that happened in the past, but is an ongoing organic process, and that human beings in the Catholic tradition need to remain open to the promptings of the Spirit and to follow where the Spirit leads. I think that Pope Francis is a wonderful product of the Vatican II sensibility. It's interesting. Francis is the first post-Vatican II Pope who was ordained after Vatican II. So he never seems to have been ambivalent or torn between pre-Vatican II Church and post-Vatican II Church. And in his papacy, he has really incorporated the spirit of Vatican II in a much fuller way, I would suggest to you, than did his two predecessors, Benedict on the one hand and John Paul II on the other, both of whom tried in their own way to, I think, recreate something of the hierarchical nature that of the Church that Vatican II tried to step back from. In keeping with the spirit of Vatican II, it seems to me that the direction into the future in which the spirit of Catholicism might move would include, for example, rethinking the centuries-old insistence that only men are qualified for holy orders. There seemed to be no good reason for that assumption, unless one wants to presume that the Spirit, in a bizarrely strange way, favors men over women. That for one reason or another, it's only men who are made in the image of God, and women are not made in the image of God. It seems to me that part of the opening up of the church to the world would be an acknowledgement that people of both genders are perfectly qualified to serve God in holy orders if they have the call to do so. That's one, I believe, movement of the spirit of Vatican II that is taking us into the future, and I, for one, welcome it. Another movement of the spirit of Vatican II into the future, I believe, is going to be that the Church, Catholicism throughout the world, both Roman Catholicism and independent Catholicism, will become much more focused upon mission and much less focused upon institution. And by that, what I mean is that the spirit of Catholicism will continue to recognize that the people of God are the church. The hierarchy, the polity, the wealth, the physical plants, none of those is the church. It's the people of God who comprise the communion of saints who are the church, and that's where the focus ought to be. So I foresee a Catholicism in which there are an increasing number of so-called churches without walls, an increasing number of churches in which more emphasis is placed upon evangelizing and helping the poor, helping those in need, than in raising a church budget or in building a new church building or in making sure that the pews are well polished. That seems to me, once again, to be in keeping with the spirit of Vatican II, and also in keeping with the teaching of the current Pope, Pope Francis, who says, you recall, that priests ought to smell of sheep and not of incense. So, my friends, whether one is in the Roman Catholic tradition or in an independent Catholic jurisdiction, or even in the Protestant tradition, Vatican II was a watershed in the history of Christianity. It not only revitalized the Catholic tradition, but I believe it also offered something to the Protestant tradition and indeed to the entire world. It made God, if I can put it this way, more accessible. It made God more personable. It showed everyone that in point of fact, serving God can be done within an institution, and that serving God within an institution can be godly. So I hope that you've enjoyed this series on the documents and the legacy of Vatican II. Thank you so much for watching. God bless, and I will see you again.